guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet. Here at TFD, we always say that building wealth isn't about reaching for a specific dollar amount or trying to be rich just for the sake of it. It's about giving yourself more options to live the kind of life you actually want. And if you're looking to build wealth under the guidance of an expert, the TFD community has been loving advisor.com. Getting to work with a living, breathing financial advisor has historically been out of reach for those who didn't come from generational wealth, despite the fact that life's meaningful moments aren't reserved for the already wealthy. And unlike many traditional financial advisors working for those already wealthy, who charge a percentage of assets managed or earn money through commissions, advisor.com provides their clients with a top-notch advising team for a fixed, flat annual fee, making it a much more accessible option for many people. If you have a big money goal you're working toward, or even multiple goals, think of advisor.com as your financial accountability partner. Their team of advisors work for you, not commissions, and will help you to achieve your smart financial goals through planning, investing, tax strategizing, and more. Schedule a free consultation with advisor.com today at advisor.com and start getting on track to reach your goals for 2023 and beyond. And comrades, come rally. So it is the first video back after Labor Day. We're kicking it off with a little bit of the internationale because we are here to talk about workers' rights. And more importantly, why jobs are so terrible now when they didn't used to be. Now, both because we just celebrated Labor Day and because we're trying to talk about how jobs have gotten so bad, there's really only one place that we can start. And that's with unions. So one of the biggest ongoing news stories right now is the SAG and WGA union strikes happening in Hollywood. And even if you don't work in media like we do at TFD, chances are you've heard about the strikes at least a bit, especially now that they're affecting things like movie release dates. We've covered some of the WGA, or Writers Guild of America, strike in our AI video a few months ago, and since then, the Actors Union has joined them with a similar list of demands, such as a fair model for residuals in the age of streaming, pay increases, and regulating how AI can be used in union job contracts. Now, the strike is still ongoing, and it's hard to think of so many actors and writers just sort of waiting for an unknown period of being out of work, especially in an industry that's already so fickle. And as many smarter people than myself have debunked, the idea that writers and actors are already millionaires who don't even need the benefit of workers' rights is a complete misconception. The vast majority of people working in film and television are middle class at best. But this strike being in the news so much has really highlighted one thing for a lot of Americans. The idea of even being in a union in the first place, and that union being able to go on strike to negotiate for better labor protections and compensation, is something that very, very few Americans experience. For many of us, the idea of a union altogether has become pretty foreign. So let's start by looking at what unions are exactly. So for those who aren't familiar, quote, labor unions are associations of workers formed to protect workers' rights and advance their interests. Unions negotiate with employers through a process known as collective bargaining. The resulting union contract specifies workers' pay, hours, benefits, and job health and safety policies. Thanks to the effort of labor unions, workers have achieved higher wages, more reasonable hours, safer working conditions, health benefits, and aid when retired or injured. Labor unions were also instrumental in ending the practice of child labor. They've exerted a broad influence on American life, reshaping the political, economic, and cultural fabric of the country. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, the 17 states with the highest union densities, quote, have state minimum wages that are on average 19% higher than the national average and 40% higher than those in low union density states. They have median annual income $6,000 higher than the national average and have higher than average unemployment insurance recipiency rates. That is, a higher share of those who are unemployed actually receive unemployment insurance. Now, for as unusual as they've become today, unions used to be a lot more common in the US, reaching a peak of 21 million in the US in 1979. And this is not to say that unions are inherently perfect organizations. While today union membership is relatively representative of the country population at large, with Black workers being the most likely of all races to join a union, historically union membership has favored white men and excluded groups such as women, immigrants, and minorities, particularly through the end of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. But with that caveat out of the way, it's important to look at just how beneficial unions are, as we discussed in those stats around how great an impact they can have on the overall economic health of a population. Like, literally the states with more unions have way better outcomes than those without. So if they're so good for the American worker on average, why have they been going away? Well, it's important to understand that while unions are excellent for working people and the middle class more generally, they are inherently at odds with the capital-owning class, the people who stand to benefit from workers' labor being devalued. For example, many companies are judged on their shareholder returns, meaning the people who own shares in the company seeing a little bit higher profits on the quarterly earnings report. Now, sometimes profits can be achieved without cutting into workers' compensation, but usually one is forfeited at the expense of the other. And so it makes sense that during a time with greater wealth inequality than the Gilded Age, union jobs have dwindled, because it's in the ultra-wealthy's interest to do so. Unions are built to protect workers, not employers, and naturally this can be seen as a threat to the bottom line of those at the top who use that power to squash workers' rights. And this isn't speculation. Union participation has plummeted in the US for the past several decades, thanks to public and private sector decisions favoring corporate profits over worker equity and protections. According to GSI Reports Online, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics recently reported that the nation's unionization rate, the proportion of employed workers who are union members, is now the lowest on record at 10%. Only 1 in 10 American workers is a union member, down from nearly 1 in 3 during the 1950s. Now, another part of the reason for unions' decline, and therefore jobs getting shittier for workers, is globalization. So take, for example, manufacturing, an industry that used to provide dignified jobs to millions of Americans on which a single person was able to support a family. Entire regions of the country were built on manufacturing. But more and more of these jobs have been moved overseas over the past few decades, or at least to parts of the country where unionization is less strong. From that same GSI article, the steepest decline has occurred in the past 2 decades as foreign competition and offshoring contributed to a reduction in US manufacturing jobs of an astounding 26%, from 17.2 million in 2000 to 12.7 million today. More intense competition has also driven manufacturers to cut costs by shifting from Midwestern Rust Belt states to southern states that lack a strong legacy of more costly organized labor. Now, as with many videos on the topic of money and work, it is impossible to have the conversation without talking about the influence that politics had. Yes, it is in the interest of employers and corporations and people who are looking to cut costs to get rid of unions. But certain legislation has also made it easier for those who are looking to undermine unions to do so. Quote, key to unions' decline were corporate practices and legal changes in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that eroded unions' bargaining power. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guarantees the right to organize unions, participate in collective bargaining, and engage in actions such as strikes. However, the influence of the NLRA has been systematically weakened over time. And even though some of the legislation that has weakened it was passed in the 1930s and 40s, the trickle-down impact of that weakening didn't take full effect until decades later. Examples include the weak penalties established from near the very start for employee violations, a 1938 Supreme Court ruling on striker replacements, and the Taft-Hartley Amendments of 1947 recognizing employer-free speech, allowing right-to-work laws, and banning secondary boycotts. As such, the decline of private sector unionism provides a classic example of what political scientists called policy drift. Drift occurs when a policy or institution is not updated to reflect changing external circumstances, and this lack of updating causes the outcomes of the policy or institution to shift, sometimes dramatically. In the case of labor law, its support for workers' ability to pursue union organizing and collective bargaining has declined over many decades, and the weaknesses began to be exploited by management extensively in the 1970s. Now, it would be unfair to say that the assault on unions and collective work and power in general has been an exclusively conservative thing. There have been plenty of Democrats who are happy to undermine labor. However, on average, you can see that undermining unions is generally a more conservative priority, and that even when Democrats are in power, conservatives do find ways to continue this chipping away at workers' rights. Efforts during the Great Society period, when Democrats were at their peak congressional power and under each successive Democratic president, to strengthen the NLRA's protection of workers' rights to collective bargaining were all defeated, despite majority support in both the House and the Senate and by the president. The tool employed in each defeat was the filibuster, spearheaded by a minority of senators representing an even smaller share of the population. The result has been a policy drift in labor law, allowing outcomes to shift in favor of corporate employers and their allies. And of course, when you are talking about how American economic life suddenly took a turn for the terrible over the past few decades, it would be impossible to overstate the impact of Ronald Reagan and his famous Reaganomics. And do not worry, we are going to do the ultimate deep dive on how Reagan messed up America permanently in a future video. From an Intercept article. On August 5th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan fired 11,345 striking air traffic controllers and barred them from ever working again for the federal government. By October of that year, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, the union that had called the strike, had been decertified and lay in ruins. It was unquestionably illegal for PATCO, as a union of government workers, to strike. However, which laws are enforced is always and everywhere a political decision. Wall Street firms broke countless laws in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis, yet almost no executives suffered any consequences. Reagan and company wanted to send a message that mere workers could expect no such forbearance. Just 2 days after the strike began, the air traffic controllers were gone. And from that same article, Reagan's anti-union stance has continued to have trickle-down or policy drift effects. According to the Labor Department, there were generally 200 to 400 large-scale strikes each year from 1947 to 1979. There were 187 in 1980. Then, after the PATCO firing, the numbers fell off a cliff. In 1988, the last full year of Reagan's second term, there were just 40 strikes. By 2017, there were 7. So one thing is pretty obvious when you look at the history of unions and how they have fallen from their peak to where they are today. Unions and more generally collectivized labor is something that benefits the vast majority of Americans. There are a small select group of people, again, mostly capital holders, for whom strong union power is a huge threat. It just so happens that the few people for whom unions are a bad thing have a huge majority of economic and political control. We don't have time to get into how much lobbying has impacted this legislation, which paves the way for corporations to operate in the way they do, but suffice to say, these corporations that benefit from things like outsourcing and depressed wages are no dummies. They know where to put their lobbying resources to ensure that they have friends in the government who will do everything they can to make it easier to bust and undermine unions. And it wouldn't be totally fair either to say that union decline is the sole reason why jobs have gotten so much shit. But these two things have happened in tandem, and a large part of the slippery slope of jobs getting worse has been due to no protections against some of the easiest ways to make them worse. For example, employee wages. Usually unions will have pretty strict rules around how much people have to be compensated for a given job. And as we saw in the earlier data around how much they can benefit a state economically, these wages are usually higher than average. But when you look at American jobs on the whole, wages have completely stagnated, if not gone in reverse. From 1979 to 2020, net productivity rose 61.8%, while the hourly pay of typical workers grew far slower, increasing only 17.5% over 4 decades after adjusting for inflation. Instead of going to workers, the fruits of economic growth have gone to shareholders and those in the top rungs at organizations. And another thing that used to make American jobs much more livable and dignified, and is also something usually negotiated by unions, which has almost entirely disappeared, is pensions. It used to be much more the responsibility of employers to ensure that their employees had a dignified retirement after leaving their jobs by providing pensions, which is essentially a fund where workers continue to draw compensation from that employer after retirement on a predefined scale or schedule. Now, I could do a whole separate video on how I don't think pensions are necessarily the right solution, and this needs to be much more universalized as a government benefit. However, what is very clear is that pensions used to be much more the norm, but they were also much more expensive to employers, and without the union protections ensuring that they are offered, they have been in sharp decline. Private sector employers now overwhelmingly implement defined contribution plans, such as 401ks, over benefit plans such as pensions, because they are much cheaper on the employer side. Now, a 401k is certainly better than nothing, but it puts basically all of the burden on the employee. Pensions meant that you had a guaranteed retirement benefit once you met the criteria, but with a 401k, if you don't part with some of your income to save within your retirement plan, tough shit, that's on you. And similarly, health insurance, another benefit that unions are always pretty quick to guarantee for their members, has also been on the decline. with fewer employees receiving healthcare coverage, or at least fewer employees receiving good healthcare coverage. According to the data from 1996 to 2019, compared to non-union workers, union workers are more likely to have health insurance coverage, 98% versus 86%, more likely to have a regular care provider, 83 versus 74%, visit office-based providers 31% more often, and spend $832 more on healthcare annually while paying a lower share of their expenditures out of pocket. Lastly, another area in which American jobs have gotten so much worse, and union members generally have it so much better, where they still exist, is in paid leave. Union workers are more likely to be able to stay home when sick because they are more likely to have access to paid sick leave. 86% of unionized workers can take paid sick days to care for themselves or family members, while only 72% of non-union workers can. So there have been a few shining examples of unionization resurging in the past few years, with Amazon being a very notable example. But it's difficult to believe that without serious legislative changes, there's going to be a huge rise in unionization anytime soon. As that GSI article put it, there is simply nowhere to go. No amount of union victories at Starbucks outlets can match the labor might of the bygone era of iron and steel. And unlike union activism in Europe, organized labor in the US has always been in some tension with the nation's founding principles of individual liberty over collectivism and capitalism over socialism. With Republican control of the US House of Representatives, there is virtually no chance that organized labor will secure even greater statutory advantages in organizing and contract negotiations, such as the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. Nonetheless, the Biden administration will continue to bolster unionism through administrative fiat and regulatory adjudication. But listen, if we're relying on Joe Biden to protect workers' rights, we're in deep trouble. At the end of the day, unions are something that many people in my generation and those younger than me don't really understand anymore because we didn't grow up with them. We don't understand the extent to which collective bargaining and acting as a unit was always an essential part of not just having a dignified work experience, but creating an economy that fundamentally served the middle class. We can't talk about the middle class disappearing and why jobs suddenly suck now without talking about losing the power to make sure that they don't. If I leave you with only one thing on this post-Labor Day video, it's to think about unionizing. Are you doing it? Is it something being discussed at your workplace? Is it something you might think of discussing at your workplace? Is it something you could support by learning a little bit more about the politics happening around you and who actually supports workers? We have more power than we think. It just happens that it's a lot easier to exert when we do it as a group. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for new and awesome videos. Bye-bye.